Do you think they should move? Yes or no? That question sounds simple, but it isn't. Because when people say next home, they're not just talking about a change of address. They're talking about relief, about escape, about finally closing the door on years of hardship, exposure, and instability. They're imagining a clean ending where suffering stays behind and safety waits on the other side. But real life doesn't work that way, especially not for the Whittakers, and especially not in 2026. So before anyone argues about where or when, we have to slow this conversation down and ask the only responsible question first. What would a safe move actually look like? Not a hopeful move, not a dramatic move, not a viral move, a safe one. Because for people like Betty and Larry, relocation isn't a lifestyle upgrade. It's a high-risk transition. And when the public gets involved too early, too loudly, or without discipline, relocation can become more dangerous than staying put. That's why this update isn't about chasing rumors. It's about understanding reality. For years, the Whittakers lived largely unseen. Their lives were difficult, isolated, and misunderstood, but they were also predictable. The land was familiar. The routines were known. Even the hardships followed patterns their nervous systems understood. Then attention arrived, and attention changes everything. Once a family becomes known, they stop being just people. They become a story, a symbol, a cause. And once that happens, even well-intentioned concern can turn into pressure. Pressure to fix, pressure to rescue, pressure to do something. That's where the idea of a next home begins. Not always because it's needed, but because it feels like closure. But closure is a luxury vulnerable people rarely get. Here's the first hard truth that needs to be said clearly. Hope is not evidence, and repeating an unverified relocation story doesn't make it kinder. It makes it riskier, because every time someone says they're moving without confirmation, it does three things at once. It raises expectations for Betty and Larry that may not be real. It invites curiosity that can turn into intrusion. And it creates a market for people who want to insert themselves into the story. In cases involving vulnerable adults, speculation isn't harmless. It can become a roadmap for exploitation. That's why responsible updates matter more than comforting ones. There's also context people forget. In late 2025, when interventions removed some family members into care, many assumed public attention would calm down. The opposite happened. Information gaps widened. Official silence increased for safety reasons. And speculation filled the vacuum. That's when relocation rumors usually grow. Not because a move has happened, but because uncertainty makes people uncomfortable. Silence gets mistaken for secrecy. Privacy gets mistaken for wrongdoing. And protection gets mistaken for neglect. But in reality, when safety is the priority, less information is often the point. So instead of asking, are they moving? The responsible question becomes, if a move becomes necessary, what would make it necessary? And what would make it safe? Because relocation should never be a spectacle. It should be a shield. And before we talk about where, we have to talk about why. People often assume a new home automatically means a better life. But for older adults with long histories of trauma, displacement can be destabilizing even when conditions improve. Familiarity isn't comfort, it's regulation. Knowing the land, the sounds, the rhythm of days, even the flaws, all of that matters. So when people say they should move, they're often projecting their own idea of safety, not asking what safety feels like to them. That distinction matters. A next home isn't just a physical decision. It's a psychological one, a legal one, a social one. And when the family is famous, it's also a security decision. There's another uncomfortable truth. Once a vulnerable family becomes widely known, relocation becomes attractive not only to helpers, but to predators. Some show up offering assistance. Some offer housing. Some offer money. Some offer advocacy. Not all of them are dangerous, but the environment itself becomes dangerous. Because attention plus vulnerability plus movement creates opportunity, and not always the good kind. That's why any talk of relocation must be handled with discipline, not excitement, not urgency, not emotion, structure. So in this series, we're doing 3 things. First, separating what people hope for from what can be responsibly confirmed. Second, explaining the real pressures that can force a relocation in 2026. And third, defining what confirmation looks like without exposing the family. Because the public does not need details to be informed. It needs boundaries to be ethical. Before moving forward, let this land. If a next home ever becomes real, the most important feature won't be location. It will be privacy. Because a home that can be found is not safe. A plan that can be traced is not protection. And a move that satisfies curiosity but increases risk is not help. So hold the question with care. Do you think they should move? Don't answer it yet. Because first, we need to understand the pressures that can make moving necessary and the mistakes that can turn relocation into another form of harm. That's where we go next. When people talk about the Whittakers moving, they usually start from a good place. Concern, empathy, a desire to see suffering end. But good intentions don't make outcomes safe. What most people are reacting to is not a confirmed plan. It's emotional exhaustion. Years of watching a vulnerable family live under scrutiny creates a shared discomfort, and the mind reaches for a solution that feels decisive. A new house, a new start, a clean break. That's why the phrase next home spreads so quickly. It sounds like relief. But here's the second hard truth. Relocation is not a rescue. It's a process. And for vulnerable adults, that process can carry as much risk as benefit. One of the biggest misunderstandings is the belief that moving automatically improves life conditions. That may be true for people with full autonomy, strong support networks, and the ability to advocate for themselves. It is not automatically true for elderly individuals with limited resources and a long history of trauma. For Betty and Larry, stability has never been about luxury. It has been about predictability. Same land, same routines, same known challenges. Predictability regulates the nervous system. When life has been chaotic for decades, even hardship can become familiar enough to feel survivable. A sudden change, even a positive one, can feel threatening if it's not paced and supported correctly. This is why professionals who work with vulnerable adults are cautious about relocation. Not because change is bad, but because unstructured change can be destabilizing. Another misunderstanding is the idea that a move is a single decision. People imagine someone saying they're moving and then it just happens. In reality, a safe relocation usually involves assessment of physical and mental health needs, evaluation of legal authority and consent, planning for continuity of care, protection from outside interference, clear boundaries around access and information, long-term sustainability, not temporary relief. Without those elements, a move can create dependency on whoever controls the new environment. And dependency is where exploitation often begins. That's not speculation. That's pattern recognition from decades of cases involving vulnerable populations. There's also the issue no one likes to talk about. Attention follows movement. If the Whittakers move, curiosity spikes. People want to know where. They want updates. They want proof. They want reassurance that the story they've emotionally invested in is still unfolding the way they imagine. That curiosity isn't neutral. It can turn into drive-bys, uninvited visits, well-meaning helpers showing up, people offering money with strings attached, content creators hunting for exclusives. This is why legitimate relocations for vulnerable people are often intentionally boring from the outside. No announcements, no countdowns, no behind-the-scenes peeks. Silence isn't neglect, it's insulation. Another thing people miss is how easily help becomes control when a family is famous. When resources are scarce, anyone offering housing, transportation, or financial assistance gains influence. Influence over routines, over communication, over who gets access and who doesn't. That influence doesn't require malicious intent to be dangerous. It only requires imbalance. That's why the question, who is helping, matters just as much as where are they going. A next home is only safer if it comes with less dependence on individuals and more accountability to systems that prioritize protection. There's also a legal layer that complicates everything. When vulnerable adults are involved, decisions about relocation aren't just personal. They can intersect with adult protective services, housing authorities, healthcare providers, and sometimes courts. A move can trigger new oversight or reduce it, depending on how it's handled. A poorly managed relocation can interrupt benefits, disrupt medical care, create gaps in supervision, complicate legal protections. A well-managed relocation does the opposite. But the difference between those two outcomes is planning, not intention. Now let's talk about the emotional reason people push for a move. Closure. Watching suffering without resolution is uncomfortable. A new house feels like an ending, like the story has finally turned the corner. But closure is a need of the audience, not necessarily the need of the people living the story. For Betty and Larry, the priority isn't giving the public a satisfying conclusion. It's reducing stress, maintaining dignity, and avoiding further disruption. And sometimes the safest thing for them is not a dramatic change, but a quieter one. There's also a misconception that staying put equals stagnation. It doesn't. Support can increase without relocation. Repairs can happen. Services can be coordinated. Boundaries can tighten. Safety can improve without uprooting lives. Movement is not the only form of progress. Sometimes the most protective action is reinforcing what already exists instead of replacing it. So when people ask, why haven't they moved yet? The answer isn't necessarily because no one cares. It may be because someone cares enough to move slowly, or because the risks of moving outweigh the benefits right now, or because the systems involved are doing what they're supposed to do, which is act deliberately, not emotionally. Here's the key takeaway of this part. A next home is not a prize. It's a responsibility. And responsibility means no rushing, no spectacle, no leaks, no crowd participation. If a move ever happens, the public should feel less informed, not more. That's how you know it's being done safely. So before anyone decides whether they should move, the real work is understanding the pressures that could make moving necessary. Not desirable, not symbolic, but necessary. That's where we go next. Because in 2026, there are very real forces that can push a relocation from idea to obligation. And not all of them are good. Hold your answer for now. Up to this point, we've talked about why the idea of a next home feels comforting and why that feeling alone can't drive decisions for vulnerable people like Betty and Larry. Now we need to talk about something less comfortable, but more honest. Moves don't happen because people want them. They happen because pressure makes staying unsafe. In 2026, there are only a few forces strong enough to turn relocation from a discussion into a necessity. And understanding those forces is the difference between informed concern and harmful speculation. Let's walk through them carefully. The first force is sustained safety risk. Not fear, not rumors, not anxiety in the comment sections. Real, documented safety risk. This can include repeated unwanted visitors, harassment that crosses from online into physical space, people attempting to locate or contact them directly, or situations where boundaries are consistently violated despite attempts to reinforce them. For families who become well-known, danger doesn't always arrive dramatically. It arrives gradually. One car slowing down too often. One stranger asking neighbors questions. One person claiming they're just checking on them. If safety becomes unmanageable where they are, relocation stops being about improvement and becomes about containment. And here's something people rarely understand. When safety drives relocation, details disappear. You don't get updates. You don't get timelines. You don't get confirmation posts. Because announcing movement increases risk during the most vulnerable window, the transition itself. So if safety is the reason, silence increases, not decreases. The second force is loss of habitability. This is the one people think they understand but usually don't. Habitability is not about aesthetics. It's not about mess. It's not about what looks uncomfortable on camera. Habitability is about whether a structure meets basic standards for human life. Heat, water, sanitation, electrical safety, structural integrity. If a home truly becomes uninhabitable, decisions move fast, but quietly. You don't get debates. You don't get online polls. You get intervention. And intervention doesn't mean chaos. It often means temporary placement, evaluations, and reassessment, not a permanent next home overnight. So when people claim they have to move now, the question is simple. Who officially determined that? And where is the accountability? Without that, it's not a fact. It's an assumption fueled by discomfort. The third force is access to care. This one is subtle and often misunderstood. Relocation may become necessary if staying where they are blocks access to consistent medical care, food security, supervision, or support services. But here's the nuance. Access issues don't always require moving. Sometimes services come to the person. Sometimes transportation changes. Sometimes oversight increases. A move is usually the last option, not the first. And if access is the reason, the relocation process looks boring. Meetings, assessments, paperwork, quiet coordination, not dramatic announcements. The fourth force is legal or custodial change. This is where things can shift suddenly and privately. When responsibility for vulnerable adults changes, living arrangements can change with it. But those decisions are not crowdsourced. They are made through legal processes that deliberately limit public visibility. If this force is in play, public speculation is especially dangerous. Because guessing can interfere, naming people can escalate, and spreading updates can put pressure on individuals who are legally bound to act cautiously. In cases like this, the absence of information is often a sign that the system is actively working. The fifth force is persistent external disruption. This is the one the internet never sees clearly. Sometimes a move becomes necessary not because the home is unsafe, but because life around the home won't settle. Constant attention, ongoing interference, people inserting themselves repeatedly, even while meaning concern, can become destabilizing if it never stops. In those cases, relocation is about restoring normalcy, not upgrading circumstances. And again, if this force is active, public awareness shrinks, not grows. Now let's talk about what does not force a move, because this is where misinformation thrives. A move is not forced because people are uncomfortable watching. A video made someone angry. Comment sections are demanding action. Outsiders think they know better. The story needs a new chapter. None of that creates obligation. Emotion does not override responsibility. Another important point, urgency can be manufactured. When people repeat, they need to move now, urgency spreads even without evidence. And urgency is dangerous because it lowers standards. It makes people accept shortcuts. It makes them tolerate secrecy from the wrong people. It makes them cheer solutions without asking who controls them. For vulnerable families, rushed help is often the most dangerous kind. This brings us to a critical ethical line. If a move is truly necessary, it must reduce visibility, not increase it. Reduce dependence on individuals, not deepen it. Increase protection, not access. Be accountable without being public. Anything else is not relocation. It's displacement. So when we talk about pressures in 2026, we're not talking about trends or vibes. We're talking about real thresholds. And crossing those thresholds doesn't produce content. It produces quiet action. That's how you know the motive is protection, not performance. Here's the uncomfortable truth that closes this part. If the Whittakers ever move, most people will find out after it's already done, and only in broad terms. That's not exclusion. That's care. Now that we've laid out the real forces that could make a move necessary, the next question becomes even more important. If relocation happens, how do we recognize it responsibly without turning it into a map? There's a way to confirm change without exposing people. And there are many ways to pretend concern while creating danger. That's what we need to separate next. If there's one place where good intentions most often turn into real harm, it's here. People don't usually mean to endanger vulnerable families. They mean to be helpful. They mean to be informed. They mean to feel reassured. But when a family like the Whittakers becomes public, confirmation itself becomes a risk. So this part isn't about whether people deserve answers. It's about what kind of answers don't create new danger. Because a move can be real, necessary, and protective, and still be undone by careless verification. Let's start with the core mistake people make. They assume confirmation means details. It doesn't. Details are exactly what make a relocation unsafe. Addresses, photos, descriptions of surroundings, timelines, spotted them posts, even well-meaning landmarks. Every one of those turns protection into exposure. A safe move is invisible by design. So what does responsible confirmation actually look like? There are only a few forms that protect dignity and safety at the same time. 1. High-level, accountable acknowledgement. This is the gold standard. A statement that says something happened without saying where or how. For example, they have been relocated and their privacy is being protected. A plan is in place, and details will not be shared for safety reasons. They're no longer residing at the previous location. Notice what's missing. No addresses, no timelines, no photos, no emotional framing. Just enough information to stop speculation and nothing that invites investigation. This kind of confirmation usually comes from a legitimate, accountable source that understands the consequences of speaking publicly. Not anonymous posts, not secondhand messages, not creators claiming access. 2. Consistent silence after credible acknowledgement. This sounds strange, but it's one of the strongest signals. When a safe move happens, the people responsible don't keep talking. There's no drip of updates. No just checking in. No clarifying posts. Because every word increases exposure. So when you see one careful statement, followed by long-term quiet, that's not suspicious. That's what protection looks like. 3. Indirect environmental change, not direct proof. Another safe signal is what disappears, not what appears. You don't see the same location anymore, the same background, the same routine visibility. But you also don't see replacement content showing a new place. No, here we are now. No tours, no proof of life staging, just absence. That's how safe transitions look when privacy matters. Now let's talk about what doesn't count as confirmation, because this is where people get misled. What does not confirm a move? A friend of friends said, "Someone saw a car. I heard they're in another state." Screenshots of private messages. Fundraisers implying relocation. Blurry photos with captions. Content creators claiming exclusive access. Emotional certainty without accountability. None of these protect the family. Most of them actively endanger them. There's also a deeper ethical issue here. When people demand proof, they often forget who the proof is for. Is it for safety or is it for curiosity? Because safety doesn't require proof to the public. It requires trust and boundaries. And if someone says, "We can't share more to keep them safe," the correct response is not suspicion. It's restraint. Now we need to address a hard truth. The internet has trained people to believe that if they don't see it, it didn't happen. That logic fails completely with vulnerable people. In these cases, visibility is harm. So confirmation must feel unsatisfying, because satisfaction belongs to the audience, not the people being protected. Another dangerous misconception is the idea of collective guardianship. People say things like, "We just want to make sure they're okay. We're watching out for them. We deserve to know." But watching is not protecting. And large groups don't make better guardians than accountable systems. In fact, they make worse ones because responsibility dissolves into noise. So here's the ethical line that matters most. If confirmation requires you to know where they are, it's not safe. If confirmation invites you to go look, it's dangerous. If confirmation makes you feel like part of the story, it's probably wrong. Protection removes the audience from the equation. Let's also talk about time. Real relocation doesn't happen fast. It's not. They're moving next week. They already left last night. Everything changed suddenly. Those narratives create urgency, and urgency attracts the wrong people. Safe moves are deliberate, methodical, and often preceded by long periods of preparation that the public never sees. And when they're done, the story doesn't climax. It disappears. So what should responsible observers do? 3 things only. Accept high-level confirmation if it comes, and don't demand more. Reject details that expose location or routine. Stop repeating speculation even when it feels compassionate, because repeating unverified claims doesn't help. It amplifies risk. Now let's bring this back to Betty and Larry. If a next home happens, its success will depend on one thing more than anything else: whether the world lets it stay quiet. If the internet hunts for proof, it fails. If people respect boundaries, it has a chance. And this is where responsibility shifts to the public. Not to solve, not to investigate, but to step back. There's one final question people struggle with. If we don't know details, how do we know they're okay? The honest answer is uncomfortable. You don't. Not in the way the internet is used to knowing. You trust that protection sometimes requires opacity, and that dignity doesn't need witnesses. Which brings us to the last part. What does a next home mean emotionally? And what should we watch for next without inserting ourselves into their lives? Because even after relocation, the real work isn't moving. It's staying safe afterward. If a next home happens for Betty and Larry, the most important thing to understand is this. The move itself is not the ending. It's the beginning of a much quieter, much harder phase. People imagine relocation as a rescue scene, a door closing, a chapter ending, relief arriving all at once. But for vulnerable people, especially those whose lives have been shaped by isolation, routine, and unwanted attention, change is never clean, even when it's necessary, even when it's protective. So this final part isn't about logistics. It's about meaning, and about what comes after the internet stops talking. Let's start with what a next home could genuinely provide. At its best, relocation can offer predictability, locks that work, heat that stays on, food that doesn't depend on chaos or strangers, sleep without interruption, days without explaining themselves. For people like Betty and Larry, safety isn't luxury. It's the absence of threat. And threat doesn't only come from bad actors. It comes from attention, from unpredictability, from being discussed, debated, analyzed. A protected home can finally remove the sense of being watched. That alone is transformative. But there's a second layer people rarely talk about. A move can also bring grief, even when it's the right decision. Leaving a place doesn't just mean leaving hardship. It means leaving familiarity, the land, the sounds, the rhythms, the memories, good and bad. For people whose nervous systems are shaped by routine, relocation can feel destabilizing before it feels safe. That's why quiet matters. Too much external pressure, too many expectations, too many eyes. Those things can undo the very safety a move is meant to create. Now let's talk about the risk that comes after relocation. Because this is where many well-intentioned stories fail. When vulnerable people move, control shifts. Someone decides where they go. Someone decides who has access. Someone controls information. And while that can be protective, it can also become dangerous if oversight disappears. This is the uncomfortable truth. A next home protects only if connection doesn't turn into dependency. Care must not become leverage. Privacy must not become isolation. Help must not become control. That's why the most important protection after a move isn't secrecy alone. It's accountability without exposure. So what does responsible watching look like after a relocation? It looks like this. No searching, no speculation, no checking in through third parties, no tracking patterns, no demands for updates, no turning silence into suspicion. Silence is not neglect. Silence is often safety. And the public must learn to sit with that discomfort. Here's the mistake people often make. They say, if we don't keep watching, something bad could happen. But watching is not safeguarding. Safeguarding comes from systems, oversight, and boundaries, not from crowds. In fact, crowds make vulnerable people more exploitable, not less. Because attention always attracts someone who wants to use it. There's also a moral shift that has to happen here. The Whittakers, and especially Betty and Larry, are not symbols. They are not lessons. They are not proof of anyone's argument. They are not owed to the public for closure. Their lives don't exist to resolve discomfort in viewers. A next home doesn't belong to the audience. It belongs to them. So what should people watch for next, without crossing lines? There are only a few things that matter. Credible, high-level confirmation if it ever comes. One statement. No details. No follow-up demands. Absence of exploitation. No new fundraisers using their names. No creators claiming exclusive access. No monetized updates framed as concern. Consistency over time. Not bursts of drama. Not sudden revelations. Just stability. Stability is boring to the internet. That's how you know it's real. Now, let's address the hardest question. What if there is no public confirmation at all? That doesn't mean nothing happened. It means the people responsible chose protection over reassurance. And that choice deserves respect, not suspicion. Because in cases like this, privacy is the outcome. There's a line that matters here, and it's worth saying plainly. If a next home can only feel real once strangers are satisfied, it isn't safe. Safety doesn't perform. It withdraws. So where does that leave the public? With a responsibility, not a role. The responsibility is to stop treating vulnerable people like open stories, to stop rewarding speculation, to stop amplifying unverified claims, to stop confusing curiosity with care, and to accept that dignity sometimes looks like not knowing. Let's bring it back to the question that started all of this. Do they need to move? That question can't be answered by outsiders, only by the realities of safety, habitability, support, and protection evaluated by people who are accountable, not influential. The better question for the rest of us is simpler. If they do move, are we willing to let that be enough? Enough without proof. Enough without access. Enough without updates. Enough to step back. Because the best possible ending for this chapter doesn't look like applause. It looks like quiet mornings. Unremarkable days. No new headlines. No strangers knocking. No one needing to explain themselves. That's not abandonment. That's peace. Now I want to hear from you. And this matters. If a next home happens, should it remain private, even if that means the public never gets confirmation? Yes or no? Explain why. And going forward, this is a standard. We watch for safety, not spectacle. We respect silence. We refuse to turn dignity into content. Because sometimes the most responsible thing the internet can do is finally look away. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.